This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, physically here for once with Max Blumenthal, my co-host. And we today are talking about the protests going on in Sudan. There's been a lot of confusion here in the U.S. and many parts of the West because there hasn't been a lot of media coverage. People don't know exactly what's going on. So joining us to discuss the situation are two of the best guests we could possibly have on this topic. We're joined by Sidgi Kaballo, who is a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Sudan, and also his son, Ahmed Kaballo, who is a journalist in Britain and an activist as well. And we actually met Ahmad in Venezuela, where he was reporting with us. We were some of the only English language journalists. So it's going to be a pleasure to have both of them here to talk about Sudan. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thank you for giving us your platform to speak about Sudan.
Of course. Do you want to jump on, Max?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just start with the basics. I think, even for a lot of our hardcore base who have never seen Ben and me in the same room, we generally avoid being in the same room to avoid, we try to avoid, both of us getting taken out at the same time. We need to leave someone behind if one of the moderate rebels gets taken out by the deep state. I would like to ask you, Sidgi, what from your perspective is taking place? And I guess where we want to take this conversation is this, a people's revolution, or is this being manipulated from the outside in any way? But I guess, you in 2018, I know that you shared a lot of the grievances of a lot of the protesters about the national budget and about rising food prices. So what are the grievances, and what is the agenda of the protests broadly and also at this point?
And then, of course, for their guests, we should mention that Sidgi Kaballo was actually incarcerated under the Omar al-Bashir administration. So he, put his body on the line in many ways.
Another bigger demonstration took place in an industrial city, which is the headquarters of Sudan Railways, where the first trade unions were formed in the history of Sudan, where the communists had strength there. And that demonstration on the 19th of December, 2018, is taken now as the start of the revolution. It started as opposing the economic policy, the rise in food prices, especially bread, then continued everywhere. In a week time, it was in all the towns all over Sudan, and came to the capital on the 25th of December under the leadership of the Professionals Alliance, which is an alliance of professional groups standing against the official trade unions. And the demands became political, discrediting the regime, demanding a democratic system, a transitional government to dismantle the whole Bashir regime, economically, politically, legally, and open the road for a peaceful solution of the problems of the Sudan, because there are civil wars in the Sudan in 3 places: in Darfur, which is most famous all over, and in southern Kordofan, in an area called the Nuba Mountains, and in southern Blue Nile. So to bring peace, that is the first agenda of the revolution, to establish democracy, and to have a sort of a constitutional conference, bringing all the people or representative of all the people of the Sudan together to decide how the Sudan will be governed, how its wealth will be distributed, because the Sudan suffer from uneven development. And that is the main cause behind the wars in the Sudan.
Can you talk more about the uneven development? And this is an idea that goes back to many thinkers, but it's largely associated with the Marxist thinker Samir Amin, who wrote a book about uneven development. Can you talk more about that in the case of Sudan?
The British colonial power, when in Sudan, developed some areas in the Sudan to have cotton production to feed the textile industry in North England. And with this new capitalist production, they articulated the other pre-capitalist societies, let us say, or socio-economic systems in place. These areas supply the center with labor force, with food at low price, and that created a situation where services are concentrated in a triangle in central Sudan, Khartoum, Sinnar, Kosti. That is the base of uneven development. So the east is undeveloped, the west is undeveloped, even the far north is undeveloped.
It's important to, before he continues, to contextualize why the national budget brought people out to protest. Why did Sudan introduce a national budget? What role did the IMF play in the national budget, and what effect this had on prices and food production?
All right. The main reason for the rising prices is that in October, there were new policies imposed by the IMF. Devaluation of the Sudanese pound. The dollar was 18 pounds, it became 45 pounds, and that affected most of the prices. And at the same time, the social class behind that is, if we use the Chinese old language, it is the commercial capital that they are agents of international economy. They concentrate of exports and imports rather than on real investment and production.
In development and production.
The Chinese used to call them comprador.
Yeah.
The comprador bourgeoisie, as opposed to the national bourgeoisie. Is there a national bourgeoisie in Sudan, and what is this character of the comprador bourgeoisie there? And also for our viewers and audience, we're getting a little into theory. We'll step out of this in a second, but just so that viewers know, the national bourgeoisie is what's interested in developing the country, and the comprador bourgeoisie is the business owners and capitalists that collaborate with international capital that have a loyalty not necessarily to their own country, but to international financial institutions and such.
Yes. So there was a national capital since independence growing in industry and agriculture. But since this regime came in 1989, all policies were against these sectors. It is for finance, commerce, and the regime from the start was corrupted. The revenues of the government are not coming to the Ministry of Finance. Purchasing is not public and in the legal way, tenders, and so on. It is also isolated from the international market. And this started by the position of Sudan from the invasion of Kuwait, where Sudan was one of the few countries who supported Iraq in invading Kuwait. That led to the isolation. Whatever happened after that,
to sanctions. It led to sanctions. And so, the first time that I heard about Sudan, growing up in Washington or being around Washington or being in the U.S., being a U.S. American, was when there was this giant human rights campaign that involved large segments of the pro-Israel lobby on Darfur. And it was it started obviously, as you mentioned, around Iraq. It was also about Iran. It was about China. It was about pipelines. But basically it was about sanctioning Bashir and taking him to the ICC. And, my understanding, and Ahmed, you can help me out, is that, he was sort of
About
domesticated.
Darfur happened 2003.
Yeah.
War in Iraq in 1990.
Right, but this is part of the kind of escalation.
Escalated in 1993. The Sudan was listed as supporter of terrorism.
Right.
Because he has members of Islamic fundamentalists.
Like Hassan Tourabi, Bin Laden was there.
Bin Laden, Osama bin Laden,
Yeah.
and so on. So the Sudan was isolated. And mainly the economy of the Sudan depends on the export of raw materials. If it is isolated, then the economy collapses.
We'll get a bit more practical because I know this will be going over a lot of people's head. So in essence, Sudan was isolated in 2003, but it tried its best to change that around.
Well, aren't you saying that the isolation began in 19... Sorry, I'm just trying to clarify here and for our viewers. So you're saying that Sudan, under Bashir, Sudan supported Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which of course led, although it's, there were many lies used to justify the war, but it led to the U.S. Gulf War in 1990, 1991. And you're saying that Sudan began being isolated from the international community, and the U.S. and other nations began imposing sanctions on Sudan in 1990, 1991.
Yeah, of course. It's isolated because of supporting Saddam, escalating the war in the south, which became a jihad war, a religious war. So all that will have a crisis all the time rotating.
Yeah, so the reason why I said 2003 is obviously 2003 for the viewers will be a pivotal year because obviously that was the Iraq War. So in 2003, we saw isolated figures like Gaddafi, like Bashir, attempt to rejoin the fold because of this idea that they could be next. So Sudan started to pivot away from Iranian influence and try to attempt to find a way back into the so-called international community. And what we saw, that opportunity arose when the war on Yemen began, because the theory is that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, said, listen, we need foot soldiers for this war. If you provide us the foot soldiers, we will lobby on behalf of the Sudanese regime to get the sanctions lifted, to have rapprochement, and to have this designation of a state sponsor of terror lifted. And why this is pivotal to 2018 was the national budget was part of that rapprochement. Implementing IMF policies was part of that rapprochement. There were various steps that needed to be taken for there to be full rapprochement, because the US talks about human rights, talks about civil liberties. Therefore, it can't be seen to be siding with somebody who's so tainted as Omar Bashir. And one of the conditions was meant to be, obviously this is unofficial speculation, that the regime can stay in power, but Bashir has to go because of the ICC arrest warrant. So what some people in Sudan are speculating is that what is happening right now in Sudan is the continuation of that plan, where Bashir himself has stepped down. No one has seen any pictures of him inside a jail cell. No one can verify he's been detained. In fact, there's some rumors that he's actually in Saudi Arabia. Yet the regime, there's the same people that were committing war crimes in Darfur, that led the forces in Yemen, are still in place. So the two leaders of the Sudanese Transitional Military Council is General Burhan and his deputy Hemeti. Now, Hemeti begun the Rapid Support Forces, which is the renaming of the Janjaweed. Burhan led the forces in Yemen. So both of them have very strong connections to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And it was on General Burhan's return from the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia in which this massacre on Monday happened. So people are connecting the dots and saying there's no way that he would have done this without the tacit approval of at least one of those powers. And those powers wouldn't give them approval because they are junior partners in imperialism, without a even more kind of more subtle approval from the larger global powers. So that would just try to break it down so people could understand a bit more.
So basically, Bashir starts to normalize, and this is, a transitional period. He has before 2018, right. But he enters into a strategic dialogue with the UK that year. Am I right?
Yeah.
And the sanctions start to get lifted.
Yeah, that's right. But in 2018, what was interesting was that this condition that Bashir has to step down wasn't accepted by Bashir himself. So all of his generals beneath him, the Burhans, the Salah al-Ghosh, are suspected to have accepted this proposal, while Bashir himself was resistant. Hence why he went to Russia and did the United States is trying to divide and break up Sudan, because he realized if he's got any chance of surviving himself, which is not just about surviving as the president of Sudan, but to avoid The Hague, he felt that he had to stay in power. So that's when you start to see the kind of schism between Bashir and the top tier generals beneath him.
Right.
The attempt to normalize relation started as far as in 1999 when Bashir expelled Turabi, the leader of the Islamists. He thought by doing that he will be accepted.
Hassan Turabi was the Islamist sheikh who brought in, who essentially welcomed in bin Laden and this kind of Islamist Burning Man.
And he's the organizer, the real organizer of the coup d'etat in 1989. However, for the international and regional community, both, when I speak about regional community, I mention Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Emirates in particular. The Bashir regime was not credible. He says, I stopped interfering in other people's affairs. But he interfered in Libya, in Central Africa, in Chad, in Egypt, especially when the Sisi attacked the Muslim brothers there. He received the Muslim brothers. So there is always this no confidence in Bashir. That is why the Saudis and the Emirates made condition. If you want us to assist you, you have to expel all the Islamists from your government. And he refused to do that. He tried to play games.
Let's just contextualize it again, because
yes.
So basically, so the reason why Sudan is very important in that region is it's the only place where the Muslim Brotherhood officially took power. So there's a brief period with Morsi in Egypt, but apart from that, it has never been a Muslim Brotherhood government in that region. So Hassan Turabi brought the Muslim Brotherhood to Sudan, and they took power in 1989. And just to make it a bit personal, my father was obviously in the UK in 1989, and he could see what the Muslim Brotherhood was about to do. And he was doing a PhD at Leeds University. And because he was writing, warning the people about what the Muslim Brotherhood were and how they're about to seize power, they cancelled his PhD funding and demanded his immediate return. So that's why he was in exile from 1989.
So you didn't get your own building at Oxford like Tariq Ramadan, paid for by Qatar.
Yeah. So from 1989 to 2005, he was in exile. And then in 2005, there was a peace agreement which meant
Nifasha.
Yeah, there was a peace agreement which said that you could have political opposition, you could organize, etc., etc. You can come back and we won't arrest you. From 2000, he came back in 2009. From 2009 until 2018, he's been detained 3 times. So the agreement wasn't quite kept. But yeah, so when my dad says the Islamist, what he means is the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, because how you can place this in the Middle East is obviously your viewers will know about the divisions between the Qatar aligned Turkey states and the Saudi Emirati aligned states. So when he says get rid of the Islamists, he means get rid of the Brotherhood associated people that are under the Qatari Turkey influence. So I'll just every time he says something, Let's just try to break it down.
Yeah, this is actually a really good segue because I was going to ask exactly about that question. You know, we've been looking at the media coverage in English, and what's interesting is that there isn't a lot of coverage in the English language U.S. Western European media. I mean, there is some, and it's mostly pro-protests, but there's a lot of coverage in the Qatari media. So
Middle East Eye.
Al Jazeera is covering it nonstop, and in fact, I recently saw that the Transitional Military Council actually kicked out Al Jazeera and closed its office in Khartoum. So it's clear that Qatar and Turkey, the Anadolu Agency, which is Turkish state media, all these the Muslim Brotherhood aligned outlets are strongly supporting the protests. So clearly there's that alliance there. And so maybe we can talk more about that. And then can you talk more about, can you also talk more about who Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is, the general? Because you mentioned that one of the first things that Burhan did when he took power is that he immediately visited Egypt, then the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So there's clearly a kind of proxy conflict in terms of the international powers that are trying to, exploit these protests that have been going on for several months now. So maybe you can help spell that out.
It is not known for the word that Abdel Fattah Burhan is one of the officers who contributed to forming the militia called Janjaweed, which is named now the Rapid Support Forces. He was in Darfur, so he contributed to forming them. I even have a video of 2015 when these forces defeated some of the Darfurian movements in a place called Wadi Hor, and Burhan spoke about that as a victory and thanked the militia. So his relation with the leader of the militia does not start in Yemen. He might be the person who suggested when they want to send forces to Yemen that they will send the Rapid Support Forces. And the two of them were working with the joint leadership called the Alliance of Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain in Yemen, and they are looking after the forces. And I think that is when they were intimidated to think about holding the reins of power in the Sudan. They found in the revolution their chance that Bashir is discredited by the people. There are demonstrations at the time from 19th of December to the 6th of April, when they allowed the same demonstrators to have a sit-in around the headquarters of the army. And they were defended by the militia and the army from any attack from the intelligence and security forces. So the plan is clear that they want it to appear that the people came to us to protect them and to ask us to take power, and that is how they made that. At first, they put as a leader the vice president of Bashir, but the people refused that. So they put Burhan. And Hemeti, this leader of the militia, said that Burhan made a condition. He's ready to be a chairman of the Transitional Military Council if I accepted to be his deputy. So the alliance is there. They are the two controlling. The other members of the TMC are generals of the old regime. They want to keep the system of the old regime without al-Bashir, without the Islamists. And this is the contradiction between the leaders of the revolution, which are called the Forces for Change and Freedom, and the Military Council. The Forces for Freedom, for Change and Freedom, want a change of the system, a new system, that elections should be held
Baba?
after the system is changed.
So he asked a question about the Muslim Brotherhood online media. Now, I'm not going to say their name, but I tried to get you on one of these media outlets, and you was very hesitant, and then eventually you went on, because we go by the mantras. As long as we get to say what we want to say, we'll go on them all. But so if you could talk about the Muslim Brotherhood media and their
Of course, yes. The Muslim Brotherhood has an international organization. It's held first in Geneva. Then it moved to Qatar, to Doha, and continued in Qatar for almost 20 years. Now it moved to Turkey. During the 20 years, Al Jazeera was playing the role of a liberal TV while it was supporting the Islamic movement, in particular the Muslim Brotherhood, and trying during the Arab Spring to push the Islamists in the leadership of this movement. It succeeded in Egypt and in Tunisia. Although in Tunisia, because of the strength of the trade union movement, the Islamists were compelled to keep low profile and to accept a coalition of others. While in Egypt, they insisted on government, and that led to another revolution, to a coup d'etat, to Sisi, and so on. So their position from Sudan is try to support the popular movement against the TMC, the Transitional Military Council, because they know this council is pro-Saudi Arabia Emirate, not because they like the radicals in the Sudan and the democratic movement. And they think that as the contradictions between these two is not resolved, that will allow the Islamic movement again to appear. Especially, it has a state apparatus. It is very strong in the army, in the security forces, in the police. And this is the situation we are in.
So we constantly hear, particularly in the Qatari Turkish media that shall not be named, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Al Arabi, and Anadolu,
Al Arabi Jadid. Al Arabi is Saudi.
Al Arabi Jadid,
Al Arabi Jadid,
which
yeah.
Azmi Bashar's little publication, that basically Burhan and the military junta, the Transitional Military Council, are basically elements of Saudi and UAE influence. They're basically cat's paws of the MBZ and MBS. But you're saying that there are elements within the military and police that actually support the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and that there is a lot of grassroots support and the intelligence.
In our campaign,
I mean, how do you see it shaking out from a sort of a perspective of sort of a proxy conflict, and to what extent are there elements in the protests that resist the influence of outside powers, and where does the Communist Party stand on this?
The Communist Party stand is refusing the intervention of the regional alliance of Saudi, Egypt, and Emirates in the Sudan, and insists the problem in the Sudan should be solved by the Sudanese through a transitional civil government, and was accused by many, even within the alliance of the Change and Freedom, that it is taking hard position because it's insisting on all the power goes to the civilians. The levels of power in the Sudan is a Supreme Council, a Council of Ministers, and a parliament. So insisting that the three levels should be controlled by civilians so that the transform to democracy will be real.
But to answer your question more directly, the Ikhwan are pragmatic, so they're not going to try at this moment start a proxy war with the Transitional Military Council or the Janjaweed because they'd lose. But what they might try to do is if there's some sort of vacuum, that's when they'll try to assert themselves. So I don't see the prospect of a proxy war happening right now because they know the balances of forces are against them. But if the opportunity does arise, in which, like I said, there's a vacuum, then you could expect that to happen.
Their attempt to create such an opportunity is by increasing the conflict or condensing the contradictions between the popular movement and the TMC. When the TMC was formed first, it has three
TMC is the Transitional Military Council.
military council.
Yeah.
It has three officers who were known for their relation with the Islamic movement. So the first thing was to demand
Say for clarification, just say Ikhwan.
So you're saying that there were three prominent members of the military who are known to be affiliated with the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood.
the Ikhwan Muslimin Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Or Islamic movement.
They were expelled. They were compelled to resign. Yet there are still, the council was 10, now it is 7. Within the 7, there are still at least 3 other Muslim brothers, keeping low profound, not speaking loud about anything, leaving Burhan and Hemeti to face the popular movement, to be discredited, responsible for the coercion, for the killing. And that might be also a plan for them to come back in a way or another. They would love that a clash happen between the army and the militia.
Right.
Because now they're afraid of the militia more than the army.
But this conflict between the Ikhwan and the Saudi bloc was actually exacerbated by Bashir, because in his last years, when he knew that the fat lady was going to start singing, he started trying to play these forces against each other. So at the same time, when he was providing forces in Yemen, he was inviting Qatar and Turkey to do development projects, especially along the Red Sea. There was an agreement with Qatar to then make the pyramids in Sudan, which are actually, there's more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, fun fact, but to make that into a tourist destination. So that kind of conflict between both regional powers happened under Bashir's watch, while he kind of played them both against each other, not just the Ikhwan and the Saudis, but also the Russians and the Sudanese
and the Americans,
and the Russians and the Americans, and towards the end, even the Ukrainians and the and the Russians. So he was just trying to, anywhere he could go to get a bit of help, he was out on the lookout.
He tried to play all the cards at the same time.
Yeah.
And that, in reality, instead of giving him a chance to continue, shortened the life of the regime, because he lost credibility among all of them.
Yeah, and so I don't want to make an exact analogy, but from what you're saying and from what we've been reading, it seems to me that if you had to make a parallel, again, it's a different scenario, a different context, but it seems that the situation is more like Egypt, because I've seen some people, people are unsure what to make about Sudan, and of course it can, and sometimes actually not clarify but obscure if you try to compare it to past events. But just for historical understanding, to try to wrap our mind around it, some people have said that it could be like Syria or Libya, but I actually think that's a false comparison. I think it's more like Egypt, so in the sense that there is a government that is allied with the Gulf states increasingly, that had made agreements with the U.S. and taken a large loan from the IMF and imposing austerity measures. And then you have a movement that emerges that is protesting against some of the economic policies and the corruption and pushing for democracy and economic reforms. And if you listen to the opposition groups, you mentioned the Sudanese Professionals Association. It reminds me of this. and you talked about the Declaration of Freedom and Change. It reminds me kind of the rhetoric we had
around Tahrir Square.
Like Tahrir Square, and then you had Morsi's party was the Freedom and Justice Party, which also is reminiscent of the AKP in Turkey, the Justice and Development Party.
So and you had a period where you had the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which is basically their version of the TMC, in power while people were still out in the streets demanding a democratic government, and the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, kind of behind the scenes, ready to enter power.
So anyway, the reason I'm setting this up is obviously it's not a one-in-one comparison, but I'm asking this more because it seems to me that you're saying that the movement, although of course there are different factions, and we can talk about those factions, a large part of the movement against Bashir was the Muslim Brotherhood. But you also said that yourself, you have for many years been protesting against the Muslim Brotherhood and warning against the Muslim Brotherhood. So do you think that at this stage, the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, would be a more progressive step to a kind of like nominally bourgeois liberal democracy with an Islamist orientation that would be preferable to the Bashir regime previously? Or what do you think about that contradiction? And do you think it's fair to say that the opposition is largely dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood? What are the factions within it?
No. Let me start with the fairest. You are right that Sudan is not like Syria or Libya. First, despite whatever happening in the army still is a united military force, very strong. And if there is a fight between them and the militia, they will succeed on that. It will not take as long as what is happening as civil wars in Libya and Syria. But the analogy between Egypt and Sudan is completely away from reality.
But it's all Africa. It's all the same country.
In appearances, it might look like, but in reality, in the Sudan, there is a very strong democratic movement which has tradition of overthrowing two military regimes before, in 1964 and in 1985.
Egypt's first elected president was Morsi, first ever. So they don't have that tradition of democracy at all.
The second thing, the Sudanese military is different from those in Egypt. They are more politicized, and most of them, and the army is composed mainly of people who came from poor people, peasants and working class and petty bourgeois and so on. So, not like the Egyptian army, who is inherited as an army of people of higher classes, of bureaucrats, and so. That is very different. And the position of the intelligence in the Sudan. Egypt is led by the intelligence even during Nasser. The intelligence in the Sudan has no role. It started a big role having a different organization called the National Intelligence and Security in Bashir's regime. So it has no history. Yeah. And it looked to as an Islamic militia. So it is isolated from the people. It could not rule.
But that, I think you're going into a lot of nuance. What they're saying is, for somebody that's looking at Saddam and doesn't know the inner details, they haven't studied the history.
That is why I'm explaining.
No, but it's going to go over people's head. You have to be more broad in your analysis. So there
is this point about the Islamists are the leaders
that's what
of the opposition.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is not true.
Yeah.
The people in their demonstrations are against the Islamists. Yeah. There is a phrase called for a Muslim brother in Sudan. It's called a cause. Cause means a cup. It has a history. Anyhow, the main slogan there is that the cause will be broken.
Yeah. let me. So the Muslim Bashir is the Muslim Brotherhood. He's just towards the end when he was looking like he was time's up. He looked towards allies outside of the Brotherhood sphere of influence. But like I said at the beginning, Sudan is the Muslim Brotherhood case study on our country. So the reason why they're called course is because Hassan Turabi says we drink Islam like with a cup from the sea. So as a derogative term, the Sudanese people call them Kazan. So when you call someone a Kazan, it means your brotherhood. So it's a move against the brotherhood, but also against the Islamization of Sudan. So in Sudan, we want to practice our religion. We want there to be a separation between religion and state. We want people to, because one of the things that happened increasingly over Bashir's time is most of the Muslims in Sudan are Sufi, and that is one of the traditions that have been marginalized by this increasingly Saudi-influenced interpretation of Islam. So it's an attempt to go back, and the reason that our country is divided into two and could divide further is because of the marginalization of the Christians in the south. So many of our problems, apart from underdevelopment, are because the fact that we live. Sudan is, in some ways, is like Syria in this sense. Syria is an ethnically, religiously diverse place, and the Islamists that entered Syria wanted to have a monolithic religion on the whole country. We had a government that wanted to have a monolithic religion on the whole country. So it's in the reverse, where the people are saying, no, we want the religious ethnic diversity of Sudan to be respected. We don't want the government to tell us what our women can wear, how rape should be decided, based on of a man, two testimonies of a woman versus one testimony of a man. We want the repressive laws that hold women back, that hold all sectors of society back, to be revoked, and for us to have moved more towards what was in the 60s, the Arab nationalism, although the term Arab is problematic in itself, but it's more to do with what my dad mentioned earlier about the parasite capital. One of the problems with the Islamists is they don't really see borders. So they don't think of developing Sudan as Sudan because they have no affiliation to a flag. They have an affiliation to a pan-Islamist project. And that's caused many of our problems. By putting all their money in Qatar, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, even though it was made in Sudan.
I get the distinctions with Egypt. You're saying, there is a strong opposition in Sudan that is non-Islamist. Number two, that Sudan has a history of democratic uprising. And number three, that there isn't the same kind of full spectrum dominance, deep state intelligence service. So that creates a lot of openings. But at the same time, there are clear parallels, and that you were just pointing to, Ahmed. When the Muslim Brotherhood was in power briefly, or to the extent they were in power at all in Egypt, they took a $20 billion loan from Qatar. And then, Sisi comes in and he takes the multi-billion dollar loan from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So you do have these same regional forces contending for power. And then you just have the whole specter of Egypt. For me, as someone, who got excited about the Arab Spring, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, is there anything to get excited about here in Sudan when, Egyptians who came out who were not organized, but who were the Revolutionary Youth and all of these various groups that had good intentions, they get steamrolled by one side or the other. The Muslim Brotherhood are so well organized at a grassroots level, and they can bust their forces in. And then you have waiting, behind the curtain, SCAF and Sisi. So I feel like there is a reason to talk about it when we talk about where this is going to go. And I hate to use, words like hope, just because of our own experience with that here in
all been extinguished
in the United States, where no such thing exists. Like Bill Clinton was from Hope, Arkansas, and then Barack Obama comes along.
Hope and change.
But I mean, is there, actual hope for a kind of independent revolutionary force, getting really representing national interests and starting? I mean, when we started this conversation, we were talking about unequal development or the lack of development, actually, getting the reins on the economy and bringing some of the natural wealth back to the people. Is there hope for that in this experience that you're going through right now?
So let me answer this real quick, and then you could come in.
Yeah.
So the only thing that I'd say about the Egypt comparison is, instead of us being an imitation of what happened in Egypt, in many ways the whole Arab Spring was an imitation, especially in Libya and Syria, a bad imitation of what happened in Sudan. So we have gone through peaceful uprisings, which we got rid of a dictatorship. And then the problem was that the Muslim Brotherhood then took power in 1989. And then in 1964, when we had a peaceful demonstration, there was a few years, and then another general military dictatorship took power. So we need to learn more about what happened from our Sudanese examples rather than the Arab Spring examples, because if you listen, if you can put your minds back to 2011, a lot of the Arab Spring movements, especially in Tunisia, were saying they were inspired by what happened in Sudan in 1985. So I'll let you jump in.
Yes, I think what determines if there is a hope or no, the actual politics now in the Sudan. The leadership of the uprising is calling for a general strike and civil disobedience. And the success of this determines whether there is hope or not. Because with the success of the civil disobedience and the general political strike, the military will be in isolation. They have no government, they have no civil service, they have whatever. So either they give in, or that leads to another movement within the army itself. And I think what happened on last Monday, the killing of the people in the early morning, put international pressure, whether it is genuine or not, on the military government. The European Union, the United Nations, the USA, even the Saudis and Emirates called for continuing the negotiation to solve the problem. The Ethiopian Prime Minister was there today to try and solve. The African Union suspended the Sudan from its membership. So the whole situation is working against the Transitional Military Council. A popular uprising continuing with determination and an international solidarity.
And so the overreaction of the Transitional Military Council has really backfired. What did you see taking place? I would say I wouldn't say conflicting accounts, but varying accounts of how many were killed. And why do you think they took such an extreme reaction? We're talking about a massacre of protesters, at least as it's been reported. But what have you seen?
I think this because the control of the security was left to this militia. And this militia, that is the way they react. They killed people in Darfur, in Nuba Mountains. They tried to make problems in many towns, to the extent that even the regime of al-Bashir asked them to leave. For example, al-Ubaid in Kordofan, because they started conflict with the people. So the way they are not well trained, they are not disciplined. They can't deal with such situation like a trained police. Mm-hmm. One thing, the people were accusing the leader of the militia, who is the vice chairman of the TMC, Hemeti, that he's a killer. In Darfur, he has a criminal record.
In the U.S., we call those medals or decorations, but go on.
He took that as personal, and that was reflected in his speeches during the last 3 weeks.
But these are like for people that don't understand, these are, to be polite, armed bandits. So many people won't know that the Janjaweed were involved in the Central African Republic conflict. So one of the issues was the incumbent president of Central African Republic, who was put in place by the French, decided to have China as his trade partner, and then this militia was paid for to come from the north of Central African Republic, come down into the south, and they went down, massacring people, raping people. And what happened was, when they left, it was the local Muslim community who suffered, who were seen as responsible for those atrocities. So the Central African Republic, which since its independence has never had interreligious conflict, had now a religious conflict between what the Christian defense forces, which which then became the offense forces, who saw the whole Muslim community as guilty by association. Now, the only reason I say that is this has been happening since the war in Darfur. These guys have been going places, raping, pillaging, scorched earth policy. That does something. When you do that for such a long period of time, that's who you become. So when they come to Khartoum, they can't just sit by idly and check traffic lights and traffic cones. They've been radicalized by being sent to Chad, to Central African Republic, to Mali. They've been a militia force for so long now that they don't actually know how to behave themselves. So as soon as they get given any sort of green light to be rougher with protesters, that's the kind of consequence that you have, where 100 bodies of 100 people killed, 40 people apparently dumped in the River Nile.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask you more about, can you explain, for years, whenever we saw media reports about Sudan, we'd often frequently hear about the Janjaweed, and it's still not really well understood. I mean, you explained kind of who they are, but who was funding them? Why did they have arms? Why did they become powerful?
Yeah, I'll answer quickly and then I'll pass it on to my dad. They're not from North Central African Republic. They're Sudanese, but what happens is,
they sent there.
Because you can't, when you have a force like that does the dirty work of the Sudanese government, you have to keep them on a payroll. So what happens is they then become guns for hire for any other African governments or any other regional European governments. So the accusation is that they was paid by the French to go to the Central African Republic, and they were paid by other forces to go to Chad, because the Sudanese government needs them to stay as a collective, so that whenever the people of the Nuba Mountains rise up, the people of the Blue Nile rise up, the people of Darfur rise up, they're ready. They don't have to start afresh by forming a new militia.
Right.
The nucleus of these forces is from a Tamil tribes in Darfur called al-Mahamid, and they were formed firstly by the ex-first vice president Ali Osman, who is an Islamist Muslim brother, in 2003. And during this time, Burhan was an officer, a captain in Zalingi. He helped in forming them. However, under a different leadership, a tribal leadership, a person called Musa Hilal is one of the accused in the International Criminal Court. Musa, after a while, have different opinion about the understanding of the war in Darfur. So they changed him with his relative, Muhammad Hamdan. But that
Hamdan is
Hemeti, and that was enforced by troops which were defeated in Mali. You remember there are Islamic uprising in Mali, and the French sent
Boko Haram.
Those troops which are defeated there were allowed on the demand or the request of al-Bashir to pass through Chad. And for a while, they camped in Jenaina, the most western town. In 2013, when the uprising in Khartoum of September 2013, those people were brought to Khartoum North and they shot more than 200 people and then amalgamated in the main force of the Janjaweed and called the Rapid Support Forces.
But to simplify it, they're essentially Arab nomadic tribes from the Darfur region that had tensions with the 4 people in Darfur over the land, grazing land. And because of the things like climate change, that competition over the grazing land became more and more stark. And the Sudanese government exploited those divisions, played on the ethnic divisions between the 4 people and the Arab tribes, and then used that to kind of escalate tensions, and which led to the Darfur war.
That is perfect. Darfur started in 2002.
2002, yeah.
And the forces were formed in 2003.
Yeah.
At the time, Al Osman was negotiating with Garang in Kenya. He cut his negotiations and came back to form these forces and then returned to the negotiations.
But the issue always comes down to the fact of back to the right to the beginning of the underdevelopment. So because the people in the periphery regions are completely left out by the government in the regime in Khartoum, by causing these type of conflicts between the different local communities, they fight against each other rather than to unify to demand a greater share of the of access to wealth and development from Khartoum.
Here, a small bit of theory might explain this. You return to Samir Amin again. The terms of trade. Samir Amin speak about international terms of trade. Now think of internal terms of trade between the different regions of the Sudan. They are in favor of central Sudan, where productivity is higher, whether of land or where the concentration of industry and services also. And that led not to even development, to more uneven development, because surplus is always coming from these marginal areas, from the peripheries to the center.
But bringing it back to the protest movement, one of the interesting things that's come out of the recent protest movement is there's always been this weird identity politics in Sudan, Arab versus African, Arab, African, etc., etc. So the Sudanese government played on these ethnic divisions in the south, but mostly played on the different divisions between Christians and Muslims. And when in Darfur, they played on the Arab-African dichotomy as a way of dividing the masses. So one of the things that's come out of the protest movement is a rejection of that. And now they're trying to overemphasize an African identity. So they're playing Muhammad Weddi songs about being proud of being African. They're talking about leaving the Arab League if they were to become in power. They're talking about pushing out the Arab influence, whether it be Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or Emirati. So there's an identity element to it.
Right. And you know, in the US media, the Janjaweed have been identified with the Arab identity.
They have fed into this kind of anti-African black,
and also being nomads. You know, the different civilizations of the settlers, farmers, and the nomads is very different. And the nomads think always of settling their differences by war, by violence.
It's a settler colonial mentality, if you will.
Yeah.
So similar to like in Israel, or I guess in Australia, or even your part of the world, the United States.
Especially here, yeah.
We white settlers we're called pioneers, not nomads.
But the settlers know without extreme violence, their place of superiority is always under threat, especially because they're a minority.
There is no difference between the cowboys and the Janjaweed. They are The
Right.
same as they treat the Indians there, they treat the Darfurians and Masalit here.
So I know we've gone a bit all over the shop with this analysis. So if you want to ask us stuff that we can narrow it down so your international viewers
Yeah,
can.
I mean we're kind of running up on definitely gone over an hour. I want to ask kind of in closing. I mean we've talked a little or a good amount about the Qatari Turkish kind of Ikhwan axis versus the Saudi UAE axis. But there are two other countries we haven't discussed, and we've sort of or ignored the U.S. a little bit. But the top trading partner of Sudan, or a major a force of economic influence, is China, and China and Russia have teamed up at the UN, at the Security Council, to oppose intervention. So my question would just be where you see these two countries, which are increasingly functioning at the UN as a bloc. Where do you see them fitting into the resolution of the Sudanese crisis, and what are their what's their agenda in the country?
Well, and the U.S., of course, like the great powers, what their response has been.
Yes,
China. And the
China.
European Union into that as well, because
China
The EU is just the U.S.
is the biggest.
The EU, yeah. I mean, it sometimes has slightly independent policies, but not usually.
Yeah.
China is the greatest economic partner of the Sudan, and for them, a revolution, a civil government might put back the relation of the Sudan with other countries, and hence bring them competitors. And they don't want that. They don't like that. So they are hesitant at first. During the first day of the TMC, they are going around trying to contact all political parties, including our party. We don't have good relations with the Chinese Communist Party since 1963, and it went very bad in 1971 when they supported Nimeri while he was hanging our leaders. So despite this, they came to our offices and they said they want to contact us, and we said we are ready. Because we know that they are the strongest economic partner of the Sudan, you have problems with them, you need to sort it out. So you need the relations. For me, I think that explained their position in the Security Council. They insisted that the council should not have a decision on the massacre of Monday. Strangely enough, people won't understand why Russia is taking the same. Yes, there is bilateral relations concerning trade and so, but that is not the important. The important thing, there are defense relations. And Russia has taken the opportunity of what's happening in the Sudan and declared that an agreement which was made with al-Bashir government comes into force. And these are the Russians and the Sudanese, to inverted commas, to use the ports of both sides. And the Sudanese has no ships to use the ports of the Russians. So the Russians will benefit from this and use the ports on the Red Sea, where they want to stay. They want an influence in the Red Sea.
Can I come in?
Especially, they lost their influence in Egypt long time.
But they could also, a more generous interpretation could be that both China and Russia are adherents to the principle of non-interference, and the idea that anything that happens in Sudan should be determined by the African Union and the countries around Sudan, not by global powers.
Yeah,
So
Russia itself said that they were going to wait to see the African Union's response. Although the African Union did actually vote to kick out Sudan, so maybe you could fit part of that in. I'm just genuinely curious because there's a lot of confusion, and I genuinely I don't get necessarily where aside from the regional alliances with, the Ikhwan and Saudi, the UAE, that's clear. But the international ones, I think, become much more complex.
Yeah, a lot more complex. So I'll try talk.
Ahmed, let me speak about the European Union and then you continue. The European Union has an agreement with the al-Bashir government that Sudan should be a first line of defense against migration to Europe.
Stop the refugees.
Stop the refugees. Stop the immigrants.
And they might as well have put by any means necessary on top.
Yes. And
Oh, man.
that includes finance. The finance went to the Janjaweed. By the way, you asked about the finance of the Janjaweed, part of it from the European Union, most of it now from Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Now, there is this decision by the European Parliament in January, which criticized the Commission for paying money which goes to the militias which are killing the people. January 2019, by the European Parliament.
See, because the European Parliament has no power, and the European Commission is the real power. So the European Parliament can say all the it's bad to arm the it's bad to arm the Janjaweed, it's bad to do this, while the European Commission
gives the support to the people, and so while the Commission does the dirty work.
Yeah.
However, now the Commission is supporting also the transition to a civilian democratic system in the Sudan, calling on the TMC to hand over to a civilian government.
But in a nutshell, the European Union would much rather have a strong and stable Sudan with terrible human rights record that stops migration and refugees entering Europe than a unsure civilian-led government which might not be able to control its borders, which won't go as far in continuing that support. The UK and Norway come into this as well. So on a personal level, I've noticed this when my father got detained in this time round. The Foreign Office was a lot more resistant in their support than they were a couple of years ago, when they were talking more about human rights abuses, etc., because of this issue of migration, because of how polarizing the refugee, quote-unquote, refugee crisis has been in the UK and in Europe. So this time round, they were telling me he was a dual national, and because he was in the country, the other country, the British government had no responsibility and could do nothing. Yet the previous time he was detained, they were giving consulate support and offering this and offering that. So that kind of indicates
the atmosphere of Brexit, and the fear of it's kind of British politics has been destabilized by the refugee issue, and so
it is complex. It is complex, but it is simple at the same time. The US at the moment is moving towards, if not war with Iran, complete and utter isolation. Now, if Sudan, the whole of Horn Africa, Djibouti, Sudan, at some point, these were all aligned to Iran. In the last couple of years, they've completely flipped and become very hostile towards Iran and moved closer towards the Saudi bloc. So this is seen as a battlefield in terms of isolating Iran. That's why we see the designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, both the political wing and the armed wing. That's why for the war on Yemen. It's all about making Iran a weaker, more vulnerable, isolated state. And Sudan is just a pawn, in my opinion, in this larger strategic battlefield.
But we should also notice the role of pressure groups. In the USA, the Congress and the Senate, especially the Foreign Affairs Committee, is putting pressure against the TMC and demanding a civilian government in the Sudan. To the extent that, and you might have noticed all the history in the USA, there is this conflict between the Congress and the Foreign Office, or the Department of State on the other side is always there. The Department of State is always so pragmatic. They want to deal with the strongest. However, this time, the Undersecretary of the Department of State spoke to the Deputy Minister of Defense or the State Minister of Defense in Saudi Arabia and putting pressure on Saudi. And the result was that the Saudi government said negotiations should restart between the MTC. So it is a matter of complicated where pressure groups, whether human rights organizations, MPs, ordinary people can put pressure on here and there, and that might give Sudanese revolution some solidarity.
Yeah, but there's rhetoric. There's difference between rhetoric and policy. They could say all the good stuff. They ain't gonna. They ain't gonna. There is a with any revolution, you got to safeguard it from precisely powers like the US. So there is certain groups that we are worried about, and the US funding. But I'm not going to get into that for pragmatic political reasons. But
Kind of funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and the
Yes.
soft power groups.
exactly.
And they've invested a lot in Sudan, actually, kind of below the radar, or low key, as the millennials say. Low key NED.
So in some ways, what Burhan has said about elections happening in 9 months would put these groups in a key position, because if elections were to be rushed, if they were to be held under a military dictatorship, which the military council is, then the groups associated with the National Congress Party, the Sudanese government of the past, would be so toxic that they couldn't assume power. But these other groups that would be well funded, well organized, would be in a very strong position to take power. So this 9 month transitional period, that 9 months election, would put some of these groups in a very strong position, and I'm sure the US is very aware of that.
All right. Well, I know it's been an hour and a half, and I know it's late for you all, so we'll wrap up here. But before we do so, I guess just the final question I have in mind is, first of all, I want to thank you for explaining all this. It can be very complex, and the details are important. So,
And the more we talk, actually, the more I want to know.
No, exactly.
It's kind of it's like the opposite of corporate media, where the more you watch, the less you know.
Well, so I do, and hopefully we can have you guys back sometime soon, and hopefully there are positive updates to discuss. But looking forward now, of course, we're not asking you to tell the future, but was a recent report, in fact, that the Sudanese opposition groups have reached out to the new prime minister in Ethiopia, and he has agreed to be a mediator for a peace discussion between the military forces in Sudan and between the opposition groups. So looking forward, what do you think of the possibility of these Ethiopian brokered negotiations? Ethiopia also just signed a peace agreement with Eritrea, which was another regional conflict that destabilized part of the continent. So do you think that this is a potentially positive development, and what can happen in the near future?
There is nothing out of this. He wrote something on his page speaking about his visit to his second country, Sudan, and making some advices, which means his attempt failed.
This is Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia.
Yes. Might be the only thing which is strange in this. In his meeting with the TMC, Hemeti was not there. Only the military, proper armed forces. So the leader of the militia, who is controlling Khartoum now, is not sitting in the meeting. No one knows why. I think mediation at this time will only succeed when we see the result of the strike and the civil disobedience on Sunday and Monday. At that time, when the forces are seen on the ground, now both think they are the strongest.
So my analysis is that because of what's just happened with the massacre, a lot of people are very angry about what's happened in Sudan. So there cannot be any negotiations with the people that are complicit in that violence, because there's a saying, I'm sure they say it in America, where turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and it's like the idea that Burhan and Hemeti or any of the other figures are going to be part of negotiations in which they deliver justice for the massacre is just not going to happen. So what I'm sure will happen is an escalation of civil disobedience. There'll be a general strike. There'll be basically a shutdown, and eventually these toxic figures will have to step down, and then you negotiate with the new people about how to move forward. Because we was negotiating when they decided to shoot our brothers and sisters on Monday without any kind of, with no provocation, we had no arms, we had no weapons. It was completely unpredicted. So dare I make the comparison, but it's like the kind of peace negotiations in Israel and Palestine. What's the point? What's the point when there's one side clearly determined to occupy power and not listen to the will of the people?
Right. And we also have a saying in the U.S., these colors don't run, which actually means nothing when you think about it. You know, Vietnam, we kind of ran there. But
I don't honestly. I thought I knew where Max was going with this, but I
Now,
no, I hear what you're saying about, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and you have enough of a popular mobilization to actually oust at least one layer of the government that and get to a new stage. I mean, that sounds like what you're saying and where it's going, which would be at least from the ground level, positive development. And what it also sounds like you're saying is that there's not going that this massacre was a turning point, and we won't be seeing such levels of violence going forward. It seems like there is some positive momentum.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. Either with a militia like the Janjaweed, they can either double down or run away, and we just that it's the latter one. So we'll see. We'll see how things escalate.
Well, I really learned a lot from that. I'm actually gonna. It's going to be one of the rare moderate rebels where I watch it again, because I think I can learn a lot from watching it one more time. And I hope everyone who was listening or watching also learned a lot from a much more critical perspective than you would get in a lot of other media. That's what we really aim to do here. So feel free to and encouraged to support us at patreon.com/moderate rebels. I'm Max Blumenthal.
Yeah, and I'm Ben Norton, and I just want to thank our guests again. We were speaking with Ahmed Kaballo and his father, Sidgi Kaballo. As I mentioned, Sidgi actually was recently incarcerated and was just released. So it's an honor and a privilege not only to learn from you all, but to be friends with both of you, and hopefully both of you, or at least Ahmed, hopefully we'll see you again in Venezuela.
Yeah,
Good
to see you both together again.
Or in London, or even in Sudan.
We'll see you in Sudan.
Yeah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
That would be great.
Okay.
All right,
Thank
guys.
you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again, comrades.
We'll talk soon, and get some sleep. Thanks for staying up so late.